Take a detour and let's put the spotlight on the pharma sector. We've seen a lot of action of late within this sector, and to understand what the outlook looks like, we are now joined by senior analyst pharma and healthcare at BofA Securities, Neha Manpuria, who is now joining us. Neha, thank you so much for taking your time aligned and joining us here from the sidelines of your conference. And when we talk about pharma, the first thing, of course, given that we are seeing a lot of action around GLP-1 and semaglutide launch that we have seen a couple of months ago, let's talk about that first. And you earlier estimated about $600 million GLP-1 market with EBITDA contribution of only 1 to 3% for most of your coverage companies for FY27. We are 3 months into the generic launch. How are you now seeing GLP-1 opportunity scale up going forward?
So I think very early days on GLP-1, obviously. It's been 2 full months of contribution from launch, especially in India. And I think we need to look at GLP as a more global opportunity and also for a much longer time frame. Yes, it started with semaglutide, and you will see many more GLPs go off patent in the next few years. Specifically talking about Sema launch in India, it's been a great launch, obviously, as indicated by most companies as well as the data. But I think there are a few things that we need to watch. One, we have seen a wide range of pricing when it comes to the generic launch. So far, we have seen pricing held on. Historically, if you look at most generic launches, you do see price correction, particularly in a competitive market. So we need to see does that happen. Second, is there any supply bottleneck? Because it's very important to ensure, given the demand that is being projected in the market, it's very important to ensure there's enough supply to meet that. So, in case companies are facing, supply issues in the entire value chain of sema manufacturing, that could be the second point. And third, of course, is, how long do patients stick on to the drug, over time? Initial penetration might be high, but if you do see patients drop off, given the side effects, then that would mean companies need to continue to spend on sales and marketing of these drugs. And I think what is also the point that you made about EBITDA contribution being about 1 to 3%. Remember that a lot of companies have invested in creating specific, sales force for this drug on the ground, and therefore, you will need to see this drug ramp up for them to be, for it to become more profitable for companies overall, and that would be slightly a slower process. Probably take a couple of months or even years, depending on what the patient churn is.
So this is going to be pick it up as you go. Neha, hi, this is Kavita also joining the conversation. And, I just want to understand your take on the Q4 earnings. So in a nutshell, what has been the most important takeaway from the Q4 earnings and which companies have really surprised positively and which have disappointed relative to your pre-quarter expectations? If you could just elaborate on that a bit.
So I think the 2 or 3 trends that I would mention in fourth quarter earnings, of course, is one, India growth was pretty strong for pretty much most companies. Partly, Sema had a very small contribution. Remember that Sema was launched at the fag end of the quarter. But despite that, the industry growth obviously is improved in India. And sort of reflecting that, you've seen companies report very strong India growth numbers. Second, there was this entire fear about what would happen to fourth quarter, particularly for US generic companies, as you see Revlimid cliff come through. And I think companies have been able to manage that Revlimid cliff pretty well. You've seen margins, the clean margins without Revlimid being reflected in the fourth quarter. So now this is the base that you will work with. There were some concerns about how bad margins could be, but I think most companies have managed to sort of, wade through that Revlimid cliff into this quarter. And I think the third is not specific to the quarter, but we are also seeing a lot of, let's say, capital allocation decisions that have been taken by companies over the last few months, few quarters. And I think the focus would shift to that incrementally, for these stocks. Unfortunately, we are not allowed to comment on stocks, so I will leave the questions on what surprised me positively.
We're talking about how fourth quarter has been. So basis the earnings and the management commentary that we have seen, have you changed your earnings estimates for FY27, and what kind of growth are you looking at for the entire pharmaceutical and healthcare sector?
Remember that for pharmaceutical companies, because you have, large drugs like Revlimid in the base, obviously headline earnings, wouldn't look that great. But I think it's important to look at earnings ex Revlimid from an base perspective, particularly for US generic companies. And I think if I were to look at base earnings growth, that would still be strong, particularly for companies that have semaglutide as a global opportunity or as an India opportunity. In some companies' cases, you have M&A that is ramping up or contributing. So I think if you were to remove Revlimid lumpiness, you would still see, pretty strong mid-teens to high-teen growth for the pharmaceutical companies. The one thing that we need to watch for FY27, which you'll probably see in the next few quarters and would depend on how the West Asia crisis impacts raw material pricing, and therefore is there API cost pressure that you could start seeing for companies? Probably not so much from the first quarter. I think that will probably reflect in the second quarter. So that obviously is an unknown at the moment. So we'll have to see how that pans out.
Neha, in which sub-segment are you seeing the strongest investment opportunity today across pharma? If you just want to elaborate your specialties, maybe healthcare, diagnostic, etc.
So within pharma and healthcare, both included, I think there's still a fair bit of interest in hospitals. Hospitals are entering an expansion mode, so there is this worry about how they manage margins as they enter into expansion. So I think it will be critical to see that in the current year, but there is strong earnings tailwind that you could see because of this capacity expansion that is happening in hospitals. Followed by, I think, CDMOs. That's another interesting area, which is, where there's been a fair bit of capex investment being made by companies, given the innovator CDMO opportunity that is coming through. And then it would be the, US generics and domestic pharma.
All right, Neha, let's also talk about the broader term or longer term theme then. Indian pharma has largely been a generic story for decades. Do you believe we are now at an inflection point where Indian pharma companies can truly transition into innovation-led business models?
So I think I made a mention of this in the capital allocation point that I made, right? A lot of companies have chosen to actually look at areas outside of, the usual traditional generic businesses that they've been focused on. And companies have chosen different routes. So I wouldn't just say transitioning to innovation. Yes, there's some companies that have moved, into innovation, successfully made that transition in the last 5 years. There are companies that are looking at medtech, CDMO, OTC. So I think there's a wide variety outside of the traditional generics that companies are exploring. And like I said, we've just seen acquisition in some of these areas. So a lot in terms of the ability to execute this and scale up these businesses over the next few years to diversify your growth. I think that will be key to assess how successful companies have been. What we are seeing now is obviously efforts in that direction, but how successful companies are would only we'll probably know in 2-3 years' time.
All right, Neha, last question before I let you go. Several Indian pharma companies like Biocon, Aurobindo, Dr. Reddy's, Lupin are building meaningful biosimilar pipelines. Now, how do you assess the relative competitive positioning of each, and
Sure.
which companies do you think are best placed in this space?
Again, apologies, I'm not able to comment on company specific, but broadly on biosimilars, I think because of the regulatory change, on the US FDA, which reduces the requirement for, the trial cost that is required for biosimilars, you will see more competition come through. And I think it's also reflected in most companies' commentaries. There's some companies which have obviously gone through the route of having their own R&D pipeline and getting to the market. But, some Indian companies that have stayed away from the market because of the uncertainty in the regulatory pathway are either using acquisitions. I think some of them have talked about in-licensing to sort of speed up their market entry. And therefore, I think the reality is that you will see competition in biosimilars go up, particularly probably in the next 3 to 5 years. I think the pricing dynamics would be interesting to watch because it would differ on whether it's a medical benefit or a pharmacy benefit drug. The market dynamic there could be, very different. And also, companies will need to have a portfolio approach. So while getting first to market might give you that initial spike, eventually it will be about, how many products you have in the market, and for us to decide whether, they are sustainable, biosimilar players.
As far as the view on biosimilars is concerned, Neha, thank you so much for taking your time out and joining us from the sidelines of BofA conference and helping us understand what pharma sector could look like going forward. Thanks so much for joining us today. But on that note, we need to slip into a very short break. More news and updates will continue on the other side.